And I will turn it over to Amy to share the design team process.
So at the Commission, we've had a long history of working closely with all of our educators that are focused on the area or aspect that we're working on. So in this case, of course, it's the early childhood community. And we, in our development process for performance assessments, convene a group that we call a design team. And Cassandra just introduced you to the members of that design team. And yes, absolutely want to send and give a round of applause to these folks who really have come alongside over the last year and really assisted us in many important and significant ways to end up where we are today, poised for this pilot test in the design of these performance assessments. So we wanted to just share some of the highlights from our meetings that began last February and continue on for another year. So this team of folks are giving us 2 years of their time and their expertise. So we thank them for that. So we started by reviewing the teaching performance expectations, which are a set of statements that describe what teacher candidates need to know and be able to demonstrate, and to do this demonstration prior to receiving that first credential. So these are teaching performance expectations that have 6 major domain areas and describe in detail what teachers should know and be able to demonstrate. So we reviewed the TPEs for early childhood and talked about the design team role and responsibilities, and then reviewed the process of the current CalTPA that we're using with our Gen Ed our Gen Ed colleagues, and sort of established an understanding of what performance assessments have looked like that the Commission has built, and discussed the assessment design standards that guide the development of every performance assessment that we use in California. So the second thing we did is we looked closely at our legislative agenda and understood the priorities that are in front of us regarding the future of early childhood and education, early childhood education. And many, many different groups are working really in tandem and quickly here to move forward, hoping that in fact, we will all be able to offer universal preschool to our 4-year-olds. And if some federal legislation comes into play, perhaps even to all of our 3-year-olds in California. So very exciting time for early childhood work in California and really across the nation. We wanted to align our work around research in all aspects of early childhood development, and particularly focused 2 of our meetings, the first one on math, literacy and development, and then on language literacy development, knowing that even our earliest learners need to be engaged in these types of activities. And we worked with the design team to brainstorm what a pre-service candidate, so that very early beginning teacher candidate, what should they be expected to know and understand about teaching in an ECE program. After we had those conversations, we moved on and determined then, of all of these teaching performance expectations that were adopted by the Commission, which of these TPEs would be assessed through the CalTPA, which would be focused on in program coursework, and which would be focused on as candidates came into clinical practice experiences, into practicums, into student teaching. So we did a lot of work there thinking about how a candidate in the future, because a lot of this work is aspirational and is looking to the future, how a candidate in the early childhood space in the future would engage in coursework, engage in practicum, practical experiences in the field with real children, real families, supervising teachers. And then what would we ask the candidate to demonstrate on the TPA, on the teaching performance assessment? So when we got to that point in the work, then we moved on and got feedback on cycle drafts from the design team that were under development. So a cycle is a set of steps a candidate goes through where they develop evidence of their practice and reflect on their practice and respond to prompts and think deeply about their practice. And in one of the activities, there's even video recording of their practice and analysis of that. And then they submit that for a judgment on their performance. So then we moved on and thought about and gathered advice about practices associated with early childhood. We talked a lot about terminology, how we wanted to see collaboration among adults in the classroom that serve our youngest learners, what observation practices would be, activity planning, and teaching and connecting with families and guardians. So these were kind of the big ideas that then drove us into settling on 3 distinct cycles of assessment that we will walk through in a minute. And then the design team will provide feedback regarding the rubric drafts and alignment to the TPEs. So what we do is we start with the teaching performance expectations and understand what it is that teachers need to demonstrate. Then we chose particular aspects of those TPEs and developed what we called cycles of assessment. And then those cycles of assessment needed rubrics so that an assessor could make judgments about practice. So we have rubrics that have been drafted, and we will be talking quite a bit today about those rubrics and what they ask for from a candidate. And then we needed to also be thinking with our design team, and we will continue to think deeply with them as we move into the next year, about how we anticipate needs of programs and what programs are going to need to be doing as we move forward in time together here to prepare candidates to engage in the assessments successfully and with support. So these assessments are what we call embedded performance assessments. They're embedded in program. They're woven throughout the coursework and the practicum experiences. Candidates work together in peers. They can work with their supervising teachers. They can get feedback. They can access resources and research as they engage in the assessment. So this is a learningful experience for candidates. They move through the assessment work, and along the way, they're learning and honing their craft of being a teacher. So we will talk some more about those properties. But the whole point is that the performance assessment is embedded in the program. Candidates engage with support from those knowledgeable others who are assisting them to become quality educators. And with that, we will go to the next slide, and I'll turn it to June.
Actually, Amy, this is still you.
This is still me. All right. Well, we are going to, as I promised, unpack 3 learning cycles that have been developed in collaboration with our design team. So the first learning cycle of assessment, cycle 1, is about observing young children, helping our candidates learn how to observe young children, think about their observations and make interpretations of those observations, reflect on their own bias they might bring to that process, etc. So we're going to look at that closely in cycle 1, how to observe young children. In cycle 2, candidates are asked to plan an activity, an asset-based activity for young learners, and reflect on engage in that activity with the children and the other adults in the room, video record that, reflect on it, and then think about how to apply what they've learned. So that's cycle 2, planning, learning activities. And then finally, cycle 3 looks closely at how candidates will build family partnerships. So the importance of family, working with families to support their young learners, both in and out of the classroom. So a few overarching principles that we want to share with you as we get ready to look more closely at these cycles of instruction and assessment. So all 3 cycles focus on asset-based teaching and learning. So our teaching candidates need to be present with their children and families and think about the assets they bring, the children bring, the families bring. What are those cultural and linguistic assets that the children already have that as a teacher you can build from? So in very much looking for that perspective and approach to understanding the kinds of interactions and learning that can happen in a preschool classroom. The second key point is that observation is a key component of the planning process. So in each of these cycles, observation plays a role. We want our teacher candidates for the early childhood environment to think about an integrated approach to learning. So while we do speak to math and literacy areas, we'd like to see the integration beyond just math, foundational math and early literacy. We want to see that learning integrated with social emotional development. For example, movement, the arts, physical development. So we want to see multiple things interwoven in the activities. And they're collaborative. So we want to make sure that our teacher candidates learn how to collaborate with supervising and mentor teachers and other adult assistants who are in the classroom and involved in planning, teaching, and reflecting on practice. And then another overarching principle is the whole notion that we really need to build strong relationships with our families and guardians. So throughout the 3 cycles, candidates engage in meaningful ways with families and guardians to build and strengthen those relationships. And finally, very, very important overarching principle, all educators in California need to become reflective practitioners. And we need to help develop our educators so that they step back, reflect on their practice, think about what they're doing, think about what the students in front of them, the children, are telling them, interacting with them, and then taking that information and using it as they then turn to plan the next activity or experience with the children. So we want to give our educators plenty of opportunity to learn how to be reflective, to think deeply about their practice, and then take steps to building on that practice, extending that practice, and really meeting the needs of all of our children and families and guardians in California. So we have some very key documents that guide our work, standards, and foundations. So we wanted to review that with you as well, because as our teacher candidates begin to plan instruction, they need to turn to these key documents for guidance. So important here are the California Preschool Learning Foundations and Curriculum Frameworks. And hopefully in all of your programs, you are introducing your candidates to these important key documents. There are 3 volumes to the Learning Foundations and cover quite a range of knowledge, skill, and ability that our teachers need to be aware of. So volume 1 focuses on the domains of social emotional development, language and literacy, English language development, and mathematics. And it provides a comprehensive understanding of what children learn in these 4 domains. So that's volume 1. 2 covers the skills and knowledge that children attain at around 36 months and 48 months in the domain areas of visual and performing arts, physical development, and health. And you can begin to see why, we turn our candidates to these documents with the intent of them integrating these experiences for our young learners. And then volume 3 takes a look at the skills and knowledge that children attain at 36 months and 48 months, and more specifically in the areas of history, social science, and science. So really of that full array of experiences that we'd like to see all of our young learners engaged with in early childhood settings. And then there are frameworks, companion documents to each one of the 3 volumes that present strategies and ideas about how to enrich learning and develop opportunities for California's children. So of course, these are very important documents for our teacher educators to become familiar with and have the time to talk about, discuss, and learn. And then they take this information and they bring it into their performance assessment work. And the final resource listed here is the state adopted kindergarten student standards. So in the work of the performance assessment for early childhood education at this point, it is focused on children from the ages of 3 to 5. And 5-year-olds, of course, often, not always, but often are in kindergarten. So we needed to make sure our teacher candidates are also aware of what the Department of Education has put forth that kindergarten, what those kindergarten standards are for our 4, 5, and sometimes 6-year-old children. So we have our California Early Childhood Education, Teaching, and Administrator Performance Expectations. So those are those TPEs. When you see that TPE notation, that stands for Teaching Performance Expectations. And again, these are statements that are aligned to national research, of course, and also our California Department set of expectations in those volumes and frameworks we just visited, and in the kindergarten standards. We looked at all of that work and then developed teaching performance expectations. And so these teaching performance expectations are actually what we measure in the teaching performance assessment. And you will see how they're keyed into the rubrics when we get to that part of the presentation. So this brings us into the cycles. And we wanted to walk you through each of the 3 cycles so that you can see exactly in these assessment cycles what candidates are required to, what evidence they're required to gather, the kinds of prompts they need to be thinking about, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Cassandra, who will take us through the first cycle, observing young children. Cassandra?
Okay, so this first cycle, observing young children, has 4 steps. Step 1 is plan. Step 2 is to observe and record. Step 3, the candidate reflects on what they've learned from their planning and observing and recording. And step 4 is apply. And I'll go into some more detail on the next slide here. So in the planning phase for this first cycle, the candidate's going to gather all of the contextual information about the group of children they're working with and for each of 3 focused children. In this step 2, they're going to observe and record. So the candidate will conduct 3 observations, 1 for each of the focused children. And their observation template has 3 important sections: social emotional, interactions, and engagement with learning. In step 3, the candidate will reflect. They're going to analyze the observation data that they collected for each of those focused children, and they're going to provide some interpretations of that data. And they're going to reflect on what they've learned through their observations of the 3 children. And then in the final step, apply, the candidate's going to consult with their supervising mentor teacher to check their interpretations of each child's behavior. They're going to check with at least 2 other sources to align their data with other assessments. And they're going to describe how they'll apply what they learned and how it advances their teaching practice. There's the reflective piece. And they'll describe next content-based developmental learning opportunities and or experiences for the children. And then they will describe what important aspects of the observations will be important to share with families and guardians.
And this is you, Amy.
Yes. So that's cycle 1, observing young children. And now the candidate engages in cycle 1, perhaps for 2 or 3 weeks as they learn and know the children, and then move through the observation cycles and then collect that evidence and reflect on it, et cetera. So then they come into cycle 2. And in cycle 2, again, 4 steps. The first step in cycle 2 is observing and planning. Then they're going to teach and assess an activity for the children. They're going to reflect on what happened when they taught the activity, and they're going to apply what they've learned then to the next activity or experience they are designing for the children. So 4 steps. So in cycle 2, in the first step of observe and plan, the candidate is asked to gather contextual information for the group of children and for each of 3 focused children again. So the 3 focused children are a child that is learning English, an English learner, a child who might be on an individual educational plan, an IEP, or needs specialized support in the classroom. And the 3rd child is a child who suffered some type of experience either in or out of school that provokes a behavior in your classroom that you're curious about, that you want to learn more about. So 3 focused children in cycle 2. And then they're going to use recent observation data that could come from cycle 1 or observation data that they have had a chance to gather because they've been in the classroom with the children. And then they're asked to decide, am I going to develop an activity that is focused on foundational math or on literacy? So one or the other, and then of course with integrated subject matter behind it, the arts and movement and physical development. And then they're going to provide key instructional resources or materials. They're going to tell us about what they're going to use and what the children are going to engage with during the activity, right? So they're getting ready for the activity. They're planning it out and they're telling us about the children in front of them and their assets that they bring. And they're going to tell us whether it's math or literacy, and they're going to tell us what those resources are. That's the first step. Then they're going to actually engage in the activity. And they're going to do this activity with the children that they're working with, and they're going to video record the activity. And in that video recording, we'll see the teacher teaching, we'll see the children and other adults interacting in the activity. And then the candidate is asked to create either 4-minute clips or one 16-minute long video. And in these clips and in this video, so if you have recorded the whole activity, you would go back in and clip out 4-minute segments or one 16-minute segment. And you will then reflect on that video. You'll watch it and discuss it, perhaps with your supervising teacher or with a peer. And you'll look for, the candidate is asked to look for and to tell us where they do these following things. They tell us in the video where they created a positive and safe learning environment for children. So they tell us what is that little timestamp area of the video. Where are they doing that? And why are they doing that? Then they'll show us where they engage children in active learning. And again, both what are the children doing and then why are they doing that? And then they're going to show us a third point in their video of their practice. And in this case, they're going to show us where they established expectations for learning. So where was it in that activity that they helped the children understand how the activity was going to work, how they would engage with the materials, how they would engage with each other? What are the expectations for learning? And they'll point that out. And then finally, they'll show us where they have checked for understanding with the children. Have they understood the goal of the activity? What are we trying to learn today? What are the expectations for behavior? And then the candidate will show us those points in their video and do a little writing about that. What are you doing and why are you doing it? So that is how we get to see the actual performance of teaching from the candidate. And then again, that third step, reflect on your practice. So go back and look at how you planned and how you thought about those assets the children bring, how you're going to develop that activity to meet the needs of the children in your classroom in front of you, and how you're going to take account of those assets and what materials. Then you teach it, you reflect on that. And you tell us about that in this reflection step 3, typically by responding to prompts that you're writing about. And then step 4 in cycle 2 is again that application step. So how do you take what you learned from your observation and planning experience when you taught and assessed the activity with the children and the other adults in the room, and you reflected on your practice? Now, what have you learned about your practice? What have you learned about the children in front of you? And how will you apply that learning to your next activity that you plan for these children in front of you? So that is cycle 2, and that takes us then into cycle 3.
Okay, and again, these are designed to be about 2 to 3 week cycles. So for cycle 3 is also a 2 to 3 week cycle. The 4 steps are observe and plan, as all the other 2 cycles are. This one is around design and connect, and then again, the reflect and apply. So for cycle 3, what the candidate will do is they're going to observe or co-teach an activity with their supervising teacher. And the activity will be either math or literacy, the opposite of cycle 2. So if they did math in cycle 2, they would do literacy for cycle 3. Then they're going to, through this cycle, they're going to have 3 connections with families. So the first connection is to talk with the families and get their perspective on the upcoming activity. You know, thinking about what is the child's past experience with this? What are their abilities with this? What information might the family bring to the candidate that would help them understand the child's participation in the activity? So then they're going to observe and co-teach that activity. They're going to choose one focus child for this cycle, and they're going to really closely observe that learning and the experience that child had in this activity. And then at the end of this first step, they're going to outline what is it important about for the family and guardians to know about the child's learning in this activity. So they've got this idea of reaching out to the families first and getting information from them, and then thinking about what information they're going to share back with the family. So then in the design and connect phase, they're going to design an in-home activity that's related to the at-school activity for the child and family guardians to do at home. They're going to plan strategies with the supervising teacher around connecting with the family and thinking about how do you explain the child's learning, how do you explain what the activity is about. And then once that planning is done, they're going to then meet a second time with the family, and they're going to discuss and explain that at-home activity with them. And then the third connection with families is once the families have done this, they're going to then meet with them again to get their feedback. What happened? What was the family's experience with the activity? What were their suggestions for making the activity more relevant or more helpful or more clear? These 3 meetings can be done in a variety of settings. They might be done, at pickup time or drop-off time. They can be done digitally by email or on a call such as this. There's a variety of suggestions for candidates to think about what's the format for connecting with families, since families are often busy and might be difficult for being in the school. So finally, again, third part is always reflecting, and they're going to talk about 2 things. They're going to think about what was the child and family's experience with that activity that they created for them, and then what was how did the connection with the family? So you had those 3 connections. How did those connections go? What was positive about them? What could be improved? And just thinking about really making a stronger connection with families and the school. And then finally, the apply piece, they're going to think about, again, 2 things based on what they reflected on. Thinking about how they might revise or extend that activity in the future, either make it more applicable for the child or more clear for the family or some aspects such as that. And then the last piece is they're going to think about what was the actual connection, what were those connections with the families like, and how might they go about making those connections with families and guardians stronger and more useful and purposeful. So with that, I'll turn this over to June.
Oh, we were just wondering, as you were listening to the steps and the tasks that are that Amy and Cassandra and Zoltan described, we were wondering if you just heard or saw elements that reflect practices that students in your own practicum classes are currently experience. Are there things that are similar? I know I had this conversation with the practicum instructor at my own campus, and she was maybe expecting something different, but she sort of responded, oh, well, yeah, well, we observe, and then, then they take what they observed and they make a plan based on that. And, she saw a lot of connections, but we were just curious from a broader perspective if what you might have seen, and if you would just take a minute and record some of your ideas in the chat, that we would love to see your thoughts. You can sort of consider that across all 3 of the cycles, observing, planning, reflecting, partnering with parents.
Maybe it would help June to give a few examples from your practice that you think of.
Right. So in our practice, now the TPA are designed to be done where students are in the classrooms with the children long enough to have developed a bit of a relationship with them, right? So that would be in your practicum course. I noticed a question in the chat that asked, would it be after 12 units or 24? in my community college experience, generally it would be at the end of the 24 or the 22nd, 3rd, and 4th unit, after they had practiced many of the skills that they are going to be assessed on. So sort of capstone experiences. Other things that we do, we adjust based on how we observe children participating in activities. And sometimes we, replan the activity, and other times we might just write about how we might plan it differently going forward, kind of that reflective practice. What sounds familiar to you? I see in the list of participants a number of faculty who you may or may not actually teach the practicum course yourself, but I imagine you have some experience with it. Looking through the chat.
So June, I see a comment that was just made about how, as they look through these cycles and think about how we teach our candidates to observe young children, how we think about planning activities, how we think about engaging with families, that pulling these cycles into and weaving them through and embedding them in coursework and practicum might need the program faculty to sit down together and think about priorities, like what will be in courses, what might have to be revised a bit to sort of incorporate these. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
So in my role as working on the curriculum alignment project, one of the things we've looked at, and I can primarily just speak to the kind of set of community college curriculum, but there's a number of CSUs for whom students take their lower division at the community college and then transfer to finish. So there might be some overlap there. But the elements that are ultimately going to be assessed in the TPA, you will see that they're introduced in some of the first 12 units, and they're practiced a little bit more, especially across, for example, observation and assessment courses and curriculum courses. And so pulling all of those pieces together in that capstone experience, I believe is really envisioned where the TPA would live in the students' programs, sort of towards the end. And I'm noticing one other about having to bump things in order to incorporate this. And I would, as I've been really reading the pieces of the TPA, I see where it looks already so similar to the things we do. I don't know that I would think about bumping versus just kind of integrating the pieces that are getting to the same expectations that we already have for our students, demonstrating practice and their skills and abilities as they were described. So, and I think that's probably hard to do with it, you all not having them, literally right in front of you, looking at the real, actual kind of assignment documents themselves. But I think that you will see many places where they can be fit together.
And I can share with all of you over the last many years in California, 22 now of performance assessments. This is one of the most challenging aspects of embedding performance assessment in our coursework. But I would argue that the outcome of embedding it and having that experience where candidates are coming through in a very supported way, the return on that as far as helping them develop practice is very high, given other types of ways we have in the past tried to measure candidate capability, like through a test, right? So this is woven into your courses. You will have to take a look at your course syllabi and think about your courses, think about where it is best to embed these assessments for your candidates. These are assessments, so they need to have time to practice the skill set, those TPEs, and try them out and practice again and try them out and get feedback. And then at some point, they're going to be ready, right? They're going to be ready to demonstrate their performance. And that's when they should be engaging in these performance assessments. So it definitely takes years of planning and discussion and trying things out, which is why we really want to invite you to jump in to the pilot and then help us again next year in the field test. So your program can have a good 2 years of practicing these assessments before they're ever really used in the decision about completion of a program, right? So we really want you to come along and practice. But I can tell you it is absolutely going to be probably necessary for some of the things in your syllabi. Some of the assignments you give candidates, for example, may need to be replaced with this work. And hopefully it is similar enough and it doesn't feel like a really, big exchange, but you can use these assessments and these evidence pieces that the candidates work on and put together. You can count them in your courses as part of your coursework. So again, a kind of a new idea where we would think about an assessment that could also be part of our coursework expectation, but that's exactly what this can do for you. So while you might remove, let's say, a research activity that you might be having them do, or the development of an activity, you could replace it with cycle 2 and you could still count it for coursework, even though it's being counted as a performance assessment. So there are strategies like that. And one of the things we do is really work on building a community of learners as we move through these performance assessments, so that we are always offering opportunities for all of you in programs to come together and think about program design and think about how these performance assessments work. And then of course, at the back end, when you get those performance results back, what does that mean? What does it say about your program? What does it say about your candidates, et cetera? So today we're just staying at kind of the surface to give you the big picture, but over the next many, many years, it will take us years really to embed these deeply in programs. We will be here to support all of that work with you and to bring you together to talk about this practice. So any other questions that we can take right now, Zoltan or Cassandra, before we move on into our next section? I do want to be mindful of our time so that we can get through the next set of slides on rubrics.
There is a question. I'm just trying to get to it. 1 second. There's a question about whether the pilot will just be spring with a year for field testing.
Yeah, so we're pilot testing this spring, and then starting next year, we'll call that the field test. So it's sort of the second opportunity. So what happens in the spring is we try this out and we get all the results in and we score the performances, and we work with programs, we work with candidates, we work with the assessors, we talk to everyone, gather feedback, and then we revise over the summer so that by the time we get to the field test, we have an even better performance assessment that is clear to candidates and purposeful in its nature. So yes, spring for the pilot. We'll take all that feedback, we'll iterate over the summer, we'll come back with an improved version of the performance assessment for the field test. We'll go through the field test process, iterate again, and then release it to all of you for local administration. So it takes us several years to get these developed and tried out and improved as we go. So we're gonna go ahead and move on, but we have your questions, so we'll go into the chat and try and answer them as we go. And we'll go ahead and move on into our section here on rubrics. And again, just remember, this is just the first conversation we're having with you. We will be with you throughout the whole experience and having many more conversations. If you choose to be in the pilot, which is probably the best way to deeply learn about these assessment cycles, then we will be doing even more in-depth reviews of each cycle to help prepare the pilot programs for the pilot this spring. So if you're thinking about joining us, just know lots more support coming your way. And with that, Zoltan, I'll turn it back to you, and I'll go in and answer some of these questions in the chat.
And so again, the last segment that we just talked about was what were the candidates doing? What are they doing in classrooms working with children, and how are they reflecting and applying what happened in their work with children? That next part is, once the candidate has submitted their response, how are they assessed? And we just wanted to give a high level overview of rubrics. We're all familiar with the use of a variety of different rubrics, and we wanted to sort of outline what they are for the CalTPA. So in general, there are many types of rubrics, but I'm just going to focus on a few as examples. So holistic rubrics, developmental rubrics, and analytic rubrics. The CalTPA uses analytic rubrics, and I just want to sort of highlight some of the differences here. So again, a holistic rubric is really looking at assessing the sort of totality of a piece of work or performance of a student. And so like this is an example of a holistic rubric that outlines the clarity, organization, and mechanics of an essay. So each of those levels, 1 through 4, has language in it about all those pieces: clarity, organization, mechanics. And it's about looking at giving a sort of holistic overall judgment of the work. I actually think that these are used in classrooms a lot because they're great starter points for conversations between teachers and students. But this is not the kind of rubric that's used in CalTPA, and partly because we want candidates to get very specific, clear feedback on their submissions. So you're, I'm sure, very familiar with developmental rubrics, thinking about how children or adults in a program develop over time. So this is an example of a developmental rubric for how a 4-year-old might approach sorting objects over the course of multiple years or multiple months within that 4-year experience. And often, again, these developmental rubrics are based the things that guide the descriptors are theories of development. Another piece, we get this question quite a bit, this idea of checklists. Checklists, again, they're not rubrics. They're a way of giving sort of a binary assessment of some performance. So this is, again, the famous drawing of a 3-year-old's early drawing of a human figure. And so you can either see that are the criteria there or are they not? Again, there's not descriptors of performance. It's just, is it present or is it missing? These are, again, not rubrics. And again, they're not used in the way we assess candidates. So getting to how do we assess candidates? This is what the rubrics in the CalTPA look like. They all sort of follow the same format. So this is a rubric from step 3. It's the rubric, one of the rubrics for the apply step in connecting with families. And again, we're just using this as an example here. But the analytic rubrics are structured in this way. So each one has an essential question that outlines what is being assessed by that rubric. So for this one, it's asking how does the candidate apply what they have learned in cycle 3 to revise or extend the at-home activity. It's also then has, for the purposes of the ECE work, there are 3 levels of performance that we're looking at. Level 2 is the expected level of performance, and it's basically a rewriting of the essential question. So we would expect level 2 to be a performance that we'd be looking for in an early beginning candidate. We then, under each level, there are descriptors separated out. And again, these 2 are based on the essential question. So the candidate has a rationale for revising or extending the at-home activity that's purposely based on data, and the description of the revisions or extension of the at-home activity appropriately address next steps for the child's learning. Again, so these are referred to as constructs, and each level has multiple constructs. And those have descriptors of performance. And then in the scoring, when, again, in the pilot test, these will be locally scored. So the way this works is that to score level 2, there needs to be evidence in the submission for each of those 2 constructs for this, this level. If each of those 2 constructs are present in the evidence, then you would move on to level 3 and see if there's evidence for that construct in level 3. If there is, then that would be scored as a level 3. Again, this is, we don't want to spend too much time on this technical part of it, but we want to give you sort of an idea of how candidates are assessed. Again, in the CalTPA, we did a lot of work really thinking about What are we basing the assessment on? So down at the bottom of every rubric, there are sources of evidence that the assessor can look at to find that evidence we were talking about. And then there's also the TPEs that are measured by that assessment, and they're defined at the bottom of each one. We've done, in our last meeting, we did a fairly exhaustive analysis of the TPEs that are measured by each of the rubrics in the 3 cycles. For passing, those passing rates for the ECE CalTPA, candidates must attain a passing score for each of those cycles. Those will be determined through the pilot, what those passing scores are. So for cycle 3, for example, a number of points available is 24 for that. At some point, a passing score will be determined when we start to see what candidates are submitting. They can take, if a candidate takes all 3, they pass 1 and 2, but they don't get a passing score on 3, they can retake 3. They don't have to retake 1 and 2 over. Any one that they have not passed, they can retake. They don't have to take all of them. And then part of the responsibility of the programs is if a candidate has not passed their CalTPA, we work with programs to support them in remediating that submission so that they can then achieve a passing score. So now we're going to step into looking at what the exact essential questions are for each of the rubrics for each of the cycles. So I'll turn this over to Cassandra.
Okay, for cycle 1, observing young children, there are 6 rubrics. In step 1 plan, there is 1 essential question and 1 rubric. How does the candidate describe the learning environment context and provide information about the group of children and the 3 focus children, including their assets, social identities, and developmental considerations? In step 2, there is 1 essential question and therefore 1 rubric. How does the candidate record substantial, thorough, and detailed observation data for each of the 3 children? In step 3, reflect, there are 2 essential questions, so 2 rubrics. Rubric 1.3, how does the candidate use data from their observation and knowledge of child development to interpret and understand the 3 focused children's emotional dispositions, interactions, and engagement with learning? And rubric 1.4, how does the candidate explain how they checked their interpretations of the observation data with their supervising mentor teacher and other sources of evidence to ensure validity and minimize the influence of potential bias? In step 4, apply, there are 2 essential questions, therefore 2 rubrics. For rubric 1.5, the essential question is, how does the candidate apply their interpretations of the observation data to suggest developmentally appropriate learning activities for the 3 focus children? And for the last rubric, 1.6, how does the candidate propose to share with families and guardians what they've learned through their observation, interpretation, and discussion with their supervising mentor teacher about the 3 focus children's learning and or development? So for this cycle, cycle 1, there are 6 rubrics, 6 essential questions, and because of that, there's a total of 18 points that a candidate could earn in cycle 1. In cycle 2, there are 7 rubrics. In step 1, observe and plan for cycle 2, how does the candidate's proposed learning goals connect with the whole group and the focus children's prior knowledge and experiences? How do the proposed learning activities support and engage all children to meet the learning goals? For step 2, teach and assess, there are 2 essential questions and 2 rubrics. How does the candidate maintain a positive and safe learning environment that supports all children to access and meet learning goals and engages them in active learning? And the second question in that step, how does the candidate establish clear learning and behavior expectations and check for understanding? In step 3, there are 2 essential questions and 2 rubrics. 2.4, how does the candidate reflect on and they need to cite evidence from steps 1 and 2, the impact of their asset-based planning, teaching, and in-the-moment learning adaptations, and analyze how effectively the activity supported the focused children and the whole group in meeting the learning goals. Essential question and for rubric 2.5, how does the candidate analyze and reflect on the facilitation of support personnel to assist children's learning? For step 4, there are 2 essential questions, 2 rubrics. Rubric 2.6, how does the candidate describe, citing evidence again from steps 1 and 2 and or 3, how they would revise or extend the activity to support the children in meeting or surpassing the learning goals? And the final essential question for rubric 2.7, how does the candidate describe connecting with families about children's learning? And because there are 7 rubrics with a total of 3 levels, there would be 21 points possible here for cycle 2. For cycle 3, there are 8 rubrics. And for step 1, observe and plan, there are 2 essential questions and 2 rubrics. For rubric 3.1, how does the candidate apply what they've learned from the context information, in-school activity, and supervising mentor-teacher information to plan the first connection with family and guardians? Essential question for rubric 3.2, how does the candidate describe the children's learning experience observed during the in-school activity so that that informs their design and planning of the at-home activity and planning the second family guardian connection? In step 2, design and connect, there are 3 essential questions and 3 rubrics. Rubric 3.3, how does the candidate's design of an at-home activity related to the in-school activity effectively address the learning needs of the focused child? Rubric 3.4, essential questions. In the second family guardian connection, how does the candidate provide information about the focused child's in-school learning and the ways in which the at-home activity will further their learning? And rubric 3.5, the essential question, in the third family guardian connection, how does the candidate seek and describe feedback about the at-home activity to understand the effectiveness of the experience for the child and the family and guardians and identify their next steps for learning? In step 3, reflect, there's 1 rubric. How does the candidate analyze and describe, again, citing evidence from steps 1 and or 2, their experiences of building connections with the families and guardians through home activities and the impact that had on the child's learning? And for step 4, apply, there are 2 rubrics there and 2 essential questions. Rubric 3.7, how does the candidate apply what they've learned in cycle 3, citing evidence from steps 1, 2, and or 3 to revise or extend the at-home activity? And for rubric 3.8, how does the candidate apply what they learned in cycle 3, again citing evidence, to strengthen or extend connections with families and rubrics? And there are 8 rubrics in cycle 3, so that will be a total possible of 24 points. So program participation in the pilot study.
So Cassandra, I think let's just pause here for a second and see if
Sure.
there are any questions about the rubrics or the process of looking at performance real quick before we get into the specifics about the pilot. I'm not seeing too many questions here in the chat, but if you have a rubric question, either put it in the chat and then we can respond to it. So let's just pause for a second. That was a lot of material that we just covered.
Yes.
No. Aha. Do we envision scoring will be done by a practicum instructor or by faculty team? So that is a great question, Kathy. For the pilot and for the field test, candidates will actually upload their evidence and it will be sent to a central location, and we will identify assessors. So if you're interested in this work, you can apply to be an assessor with us. And there is a, we a stipend for assessors in the pilot tests and the field tests. You can come along and help score. In the future, when we release this to all of you to use locally for local administration, there will be guidelines for who can score. The assessor needs to hold an early childhood credential or permit and or teach as faculty in an early childhood program. And there will be some specific recommendations around who the assessors will be, but they will be identified locally by programs. And then the programs will collect the work from candidates and then determine how they want to then score it using the rubric. So one could imagine that there's a due date, let's just take cycle 1, because these are meant to be done over time. So let's say candidates engage in cycle 1 late in the fall, and they have to turn it all in by what's today, December 14th. And then you bring together your faculty and you do some training with them based on what we call marker papers, where they're looking at performances of what does a performance of a 3 look like, a 2, a 1 on these rubrics. And then they would go ahead and begin to individually score the work. And then you would get those results back to candidates. But for the pilot and the field test, that will all be handled online and distributed and shared out to all of you as we go along in this kind of a format, in an online format. But when we get to actual administration, it will be done locally, scored locally, and maintained within your program for now. So it could be practicum instructors or faculty teams. And then there's a program instructor is a faculty member who teaches a practicum course. It could be. So we're looking for both early childhood educators who are currently working in early childhood environments to perhaps come along and help us score and look at this teaching practice. And then we're also looking at faculty, so both. Mentor teachers, supervising teachers, as long as they hold the appropriate permit or credential, then they could, yes, they could absolutely help with the assessment. All right, well, let's go ahead and continue on and share some specifics with you about the pilot study that we are about to begin in a couple of months here. So Cassandra, back to you. Thank you.
Yes, this is an exciting time. So requirements for programs that would like to participate in the pilot study. The candidates participating in the pilot must be in settings where they are able to engage in-person and or synchronous instruction with children. So they need to be in a setting where they are with real children. They would need a placement in a classroom with children between the ages of 3 and 5. They need to have a minimum of 2 weeks in their placement per cycle. The cycles are designed to take 2 to 3 weeks per cycle to complete. And they need to have a placement in a state preschool, Title V or Title 22 licensed setting, Head Start or TK. Family childcare settings and before and after school settings are not eligible for the pilot. Programs interested in participating should complete the ECE CalTPA pilot test recruitment survey, and there is a link there. Can we also put that link in the chat for people, please? In case they're interested, programs are interested.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks, Fred. And there are some ongoing supports. The CTC will not leave you hanging or on your own with this. So weekly CTC hosted office hours for candidates and programs. Zoltan and I often do those together, and they're actually some of our favorite part of the week. Ongoing support via email. There is an email address that you can send us questions at any time. You do not have to wait for a webinar or a deep dive or office hours. Informational and support webinars like the one we're doing today, and there will be more in January and February. Program guide, a program guide for each program outlining effective program practices to support candidates who are completing the ECE CalTPA. And the CTC YouTube channel with archived resources. And someone asked a little while ago in the chat about today's webinar. It is being recorded, and that will be in the YouTube channel that we have. And I believe Fred posted the link for that. Fred, if you could please post that again, I'd appreciate it. And also we have a comprehensive website with resources and guides listed. We are here to support you. I'll turn it over to Fred.
Thank you. We created a survey in which we posted to find out information from interested institutions willing to participate in the pilot study. To date, we have 32 programs who would be able to participate in the pilot slated for spring 2022. So far, these are the programs here. So far we have 22 community colleges, 4 CSUs, 5 privates, and 1 UC. And then also, if you look in the chat, you will see a link to participate within the survey.
So we do hope you will consider, if you haven't yet, joining this pilot or consider joining the field test next year. As I pointed out earlier in the presentation, really and truly, I can't say this enough to programs, the best way to really learn about these cycles of assessment is to actually try them out with your candidates. And now is the time to do that before they are moved along in their development. And let's say in the future, many years from now, there's actually a performance standard that candidates would have to meet and pass the assessment. Right now, we're just early in the development, we're trying it out, and we really need your help to make sure that we are developing performance assessments that are purposeful, very useful to you as faculty and those who supervise and work with teachers in practicum settings, to make sure that these are the kinds of things we really want our beginning teachers to be able to know about and demonstrate. So now is the time to get involved. We'd love to have you with us. So next slide, just quickly how this is all going to happen. What's next? Today, here we are at the informational webinar. So I'm glad you could be with us. In January, we will begin to offer support webinars for those programs that have specifically signed up for the pilots. So if you signed up for the pilots and you're going to try out cycle 1, we will have a 2-hour in-depth review of cycle 1 and all the rubrics and expectations for you in January. Then we'll repeat that for cycle 2 for those programs trying out cycle 2, and then cycle 3 for those programs trying out cycle 3. Then that will give you some time to kind of wrap your minds around the expectations and weave it into your program coursework. In March, we'll have a kickoff for those in the pilot and review all the expectations again. Then candidates will engage in doing the pilot between March and May. We will have to close it up towards the end of May so that we can do the scoring work, because looking at that real teacher performance, looking at those videos, reading those responses is what helps us know whether the assessment is working or not, and also helps us learn if the rubrics have been pitched at the right levels of performance. And then we work on it throughout the spring. And of course, our design team that we introduced you to and spoke about earlier, who has just been instrumental in helping us get to today, we will be bringing all of this feedback to them for their input and their expertise so they can help us then iterate over the summer and get ready for the field test next year in the fall. And then as we look into the future, we score that field test in the spring of 23, and then we release the materials and the rubrics and continue to offer the supports as we head into the fall of 2023. And all of you are using this in a local administration. So a multi-year effort. And again, can't say thank you enough to our wonderful design team. So we want to make sure that we have been able to respond to your questions. So if there are any more lingering questions, or maybe Zoltan, we could go back to a gallery view so we can kind of see everybody. If you have any other additional questions right now, we'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap up, and we certainly will wrap up at the top of the hour, right at 3 o'clock. And yes, if you are interested in becoming an assessor, we put the link in the chat for you. I don't know why these links are so crazy long, but just click on that. It will take you right where you need to go, and you can apply to be an assessor. Well, thank you, Kathy, for telling us that this was helpful to you. We really do mean it when we say we're here to help you and be supportive in this work, and we're all learning this work together. So we're looking forward to building our relationships with you as we go along. So glad that today was helpful, and keep watching and checking the listserv, because we will continue to let you know as these types of events come along. Again, if you haven't yet filled out the survey to join the pilot and you'd like to try it out, even if you're trying it out with just one candidate or 5 candidates, or you want to work with a whole group of candidates to see how they can engage with this, all of that is possible. So do be in touch with us, and we'll bring you along with us on this journey. All right, my friends. Well, I'm not really seeing any new questions come in. So we're going to give you back a few minutes in your, I'm sure, very busy afternoon. We wish you all just a wonderful holiday. Hope you all get some rest and get to spend time with friends and family. And we look forward to being with you in the new year and moving forward with this development work. Thank you very much. And thank you to all my facilitators who helped share. Thanks, Fred and Cassandra. Thank you, June. Thank you,
One
Sultan.
moment.
And thank
Sorry
you to those of you who are here with us, Jan Fish and others who are on our design team. Thank you for being here. We
one
really
moment.
Appreciate it.
One moment, Amy, sorry to interrupt, but it says the link does not seem to be the correct one. Are you talking about the link for the pilot program or to be an assessor?
To be an assessor.
Okay. Can we try that again, Fred
not-
or Lori?
And it's not the same link that I think Lori posted in our design team meeting.
That's
Okay.
correct, 'cause I just went to it and it's doesn't have anything about our assessment listed.
Interesting.
Well, I'm so glad you guys were interested enough to click on the link and let us know it's not working. We'll make sure we get you the right link. Those of you who are working with the commission and know that there's a document that comes out on Friday afternoons called the PSDE News. Maybe we can put that link in the chat, but that is like a Friday kind of roundup of all the work the commission is working on. And whenever we have the need to have people come along and work with us, we put it in the PSDE News on Friday. So that's another place to get the link. Otherwise, we will make sure that we get the link out and posted so that you can access that. We apologize for it not working.
And make sure you reach out by email as well.
That's right. Yes, you can reach us at this ECE CalTPA at ctc.ca.gov and let us know that you want access to the assessor application or to the pilot survey, and we would love to get that to you. So thank you, Sandra, and thank you too for being on the design team for pointing that out.